The rain in Boston was unforgiving that Tuesday evening, blurring the city lights into streaks of cold, hard gold. Harborview Restaurant was supposed to be a sanctuary, a quiet place for Julian St. James to unwind after a brutal merger at Whitmore Capital. He stood by the mahogany host stand, brushing the dampness from his tailored wool coat, when the illusion of his perfect 7-year marriage shattered. Through the dimly lit, smoke-glass partition of the VIP section, he saw her, Margot, his wife. She was supposed to be at a gallery opening in New York. Yet there she sat, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, her elegant fingers intricately laced with those of Dominic Beaumont. I saw them holding hands. It wasn't just a touch, it was an anchor. My cheating wife froze as she caught my eye through the flickering shadows. Then I stepped closer. If stories like this speak to you, stay with me. The rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harborview Restaurant sounded like applause from a cynical audience. It was Tuesday, 8:15 p.m. Boston's Back Bay was drowned in a freezing, relentless downpour, turning the city into an oil painting of smeared headlights and gray shadows. Julian St. James handed his dripping wool coat to the coat check girl. He didn't want a table. He just wanted a Macallan neat, a quiet corner at the mahogany bar, and an hour to scrub the stench of a grueling 12-hour board meeting from his mind. He was a partner at Whitmore Capital. His blood pressure was a currency, and today he had spent too much of it. Mr. St. James, or the maitre d', a polished man named Henri, greeted him with a practiced dip of his chin. "A pleasure. We weren't expecting you." "Just a drink, Henri," Julian murmured, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit. "Keep a tab open." As Julian turned toward the ambient glow of the bar, his gaze swept over the VIP dining area. The space was separated by partitions of smoked glass and wrought iron, designed specifically to offer the city's elite an illusion of invisibility. It was a space Julian knew well. He stopped, his Italian leather shoes cemented to the hardwood floor. The low hum of jazz and the sophisticated clinking of crystal suddenly vanished, replaced by a deafening oceanic roar rushing through his ears. Through a gap in the frosted glass, illuminated by the trembling flame of a single taper candle, he saw her, Margot. His wife of 7 years was supposed to be in Manhattan. She had kissed his cheek that morning, smelling of expensive bergamot and lies, complaining about the tedious gallery curators she had to entertain in Soho. Yet here she was, less than 3 miles from their penthouse. She was wearing the backless emerald silk dress he had bought her for their anniversary, the dress he hadn't seen her wear in 2 years. But it wasn't the dress that paralyzed Julian. It was her hands. Sitting across from her was Dominic Beaumont. Julian recognized the architect instantly. The tousled dark hair, the rugged, arrogant jawline that always seemed to mock the rigid corporate world Julian inhabited. Dominic's elbows were on the table, leaning in close, invading the space that legally and morally belonged to Julian. Dominic's large, calloused hands were completely enveloping Margot's pale, manicured ones. His thumb was slowly, rhythmically stroking the knuckles of her left hand, right over her platinum wedding band. Julian watched, unable to breathe, as Margot leaned forward. Her face, usually so composed, so icy and untouchable, was entirely undone. Her eyes were dark, dilated, swimming with a raw, desperate kind of hunger Julian had never witnessed in their marital bed. She laughed at something Dominic whispered, a breathless, secret sound that felt like a knife slipping between Julian's ribs. I saw them holding hands. It was the purest form of betrayal. Sex was physical, a collision of bodies. But this soft, quiet intimacy in a public space, this was ownership. A cold, terrifying calm washed over Julian. The initial shock froze into something hard, sharp, and infinitely dangerous. He didn't turn away. He didn't storm out into the rain. He took a step, then another. He moved past the maitre d', ignoring the sudden, confused call of, "Sir?" Julian bypassed the host stand, walking with the slow, deliberate grace of an executioner. He approached the open entrance of the VIP section. The candlelight caught his silhouette, casting a long, dark shadow across their table. Margot was in the middle of a smile when she felt the shift in the air. She turned her head instinctively, her eyes locked onto Julian's. The transformation was violent. The blood instantly drained from her beautiful face, leaving it the color of ash. Her mouth parted in silent horror. The soft, hungry look in her eyes shattered, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. She completely froze, a statue caught in the headlights of her own destruction. Dominic, feeling the sudden rigidity in her hands, followed her gaze. Julian stopped at the edge of their table. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch. He simply looked down at their intertwined fingers, then up into his wife's trembling eyes. "Enjoying the New York art scene, Margot?" Julian's voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a collapsing building. The drive back to the Ivory Tower penthouse was a blur of neon reflections and the rhythmic, hypnotic slap of the windshield wipers. Julian St. James did not remember paying the maitre d'Henri. He did not remember the cold walk to his Aston Martin. He only remembered the suffocating silence he had left behind at Harborview Restaurant, abandoning Margot and Dominic to the wreckage of their exposed secret. Now the sprawling minimalist living room of their penthouse was plunged into absolute darkness, save for the ambient glow of the Boston skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian sat in his leather armchair, the heavy crystal glass of Macallan warming in his grip. He had not taken a single sip. His mind, trained by years of corporate warfare at Whitmore Capital, had already bypassed the predictable stages of grief. It had gone straight to calculation. The prenuptial agreement. It was a fortress of legal clauses designed to protect the Sinclair family's generational wealth and his own formidable stake in the firm. Infidelity was grounds for the dismissal of certain financial protections, but proving it required more than a singular, shadowy moment of hand-holding in a restaurant. If he filed for divorce tomorrow without absolute, undeniable leverage, the fallout could trigger a board vote of no confidence. He could lose everything he had spent a decade building. The soft chime of the private elevator echoed through the cavernous space. Julian did not move. He listened to the frantic click of Margot's heels against the marble foyer. The lights flickered on in the hallway, casting a long, trembling beam across the Persian rug. She stepped into the living room, her emerald silk dress damp at the hem, her perfect hair slightly undone by the rain. She saw his silhouette in the chair and stopped abruptly. Her chest heaved. The terror in her eyes from the restaurant had not faded. It had crystallized into a desperate, frantic panic. "Julian," she breathed, her voice cracking in the quiet room. She took a tentative step forward, her fingers twisting the gold clasp of her clutch until her knuckles turned white. "Julian, please, you have to let me explain. It wasn't what you thought." He took a slow sip of his scotch. The amber liquid burned a familiar grounding path down his throat. "Wasn't it?" "No," she said quickly, the lie stumbling out of her mouth before she could refine its edges. "Dominic, Mr. Beaumont and we were discussing the architectural plans for the new wing of the gallery. I came back early from New York because the investor meeting fell through. I was going to tell you, but he insisted we review the blueprints immediately." It was a pathetic, insulting fabrication. The gallery was in Manhattan. Dominic was a residential architect based in Boston, known for designing sprawling estates, not commercial art spaces, and one did not review structural blueprints by caressing a married woman's hand in a candlelit VIP booth. Julian set the glass down on the mahogany side table. The soft clink sounded like a hammer dropping in a courtroom. "Blueprints," Julian repeated, his tone entirely devoid of inflection. He stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow her. He walked toward her, his footsteps deliberate, echoing against the marble floor. Margot visibly shrank back, her shoulder blades pressing against the cold, textured wallpaper of the foyer. She braced herself for the explosion. She expected him to scream, to hurl the crystal glass against the wall, to demand a tearful confession. She knew how to handle men when they were angry. Anger was an emotion she could manipulate. Instead, Julian stopped mere inches from her face. He looked down at her, his expression as unreadable and impenetrable as polished granite. He reached out, his fingers lightly brushing a stray, damp curl away from her cheek. She flinched, a microscopic tremor running down her spine at the sheer coldness of his touch. "You must be exhausted from your trip, Margot," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft, carrying the terrifying calm of the eye of a hurricane. "And from all that planning, you should get some rest. We have the hospital charity gala to attend on Friday. You need to look your absolute best. He pulled his hand back, leaving her skin burning. He walked past her, heading toward the master bedroom, leaving his wife stranded in the deafening silence of a war she had no idea how to fight. Wednesday morning broke over Boston with a cruel, crisp brilliance. The rainstorm had passed, leaving the city streets washed clean, but inside the ivory tower penthouse, the air was suffocatingly thick. Margot had not slept. She had spent the entire night lying rigidly in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear the sound of Julian's footsteps. They never came. When she finally emerged, wrapped tightly in a silk robe, the rich scent of dark roast coffee wafted from the kitchen. Julian was already at the Marble Island, impeccably dressed in a bespoke navy brioni suit. The Financial Times spread open before him. He looked up as she entered, his expression completely serene, a flawless mask of corporate composure. "Good morning," he said. His voice was smooth, devoid of the jagged, terrifying edge from the night before. "Good morning," Margot replied, her throat dry. She poured herself a cup of coffee, hating how her hand trembled, making the porcelain rattle against the saucer. Julian turned a page of the newspaper. The crisp rustle sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I hope you slept well. You looked rather pale last night. The trip from New York must have been exhausting." He was testing her. He was handing her the rope, waiting in perfect stillness to see if she would hang herself with another lie. "I slept fine," she forced the words out, gripping the warm mug like a lifeline. "Just tired from the travel." "From a 45-minute flight?" Julian murmured, his eyes scanning the stock index. "Fascinating." Margot swallowed hard, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She needed to change the subject, to establish some desperate semblance of normalcy before she suffocated. "What is your schedule today?" "Meetings. A potential acquisition in the commercial real estate sector," Julian replied casually, taking a slow sip of his espresso. He finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. They were entirely unreadable. "Actually, reviewing the structural portfolios made me think of your gallery expansion. Have you considered looking into local talent for the redesign? Someone familiar with intimate spaces." The coffee turned to ash in Margot's mouth. She could not look away from his gaze. "Local talent?" "Yes," Julian said, his lips curving into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Someone who knows how to build a strong foundation. I've heard Dominic Beaumont is quite hands-on with his clients, very attentive to the smallest details." Margot's breath hitched in her chest. Her fingers tightened around the mug until her knuckles turned a stark white. He knew. The absolute certainty of it crushed the air out of the room. But the fact that he was weaponizing the knowledge, serving it to her over morning coffee instead of demanding a divorce, was infinitely more terrifying. It was a game of psychological Russian roulette, and Julian was calmly spinning the cylinder. "I haven't decided yet," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "Take your time," Julian said, folding the newspaper with precise, deliberate movements. He stood up, adjusting his silk tie. "A poorly planned foundation can cause the entire structure to collapse. And we wouldn't want that, would we, Margot? Not after everything we've built together." He walked over to her, pausing just close enough for her to feel the chill radiating from him, smelling his sharp, woody cologne. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small, sleek black velvet box, placing it gently on the cold marble counter next to her trembling hand. "For the charity gala on Friday," he said softly. "Make sure you wear it." Without another word, Julian turned and walked toward the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut with a soft chime, leaving Margot entirely alone in the deafening silence of their home. With shaking fingers, she opened the velvet box. Inside rested a vintage Cartier watch, its delicate face surrounded by flawless, glittering diamonds. But it wasn't the jewelry that made her stomach drop. It was the small, heavy cardstock note tucked beneath the velvet cushion, written in Julian's elegant, sweeping script. "Time is running out." Margot closed her eyes, a single hot tear slipping down her pale cheek. The ghost in her marriage had finally woken up, and it was demanding blood. The executive floor of Whitmore Capital was a sterile sanctuary of glass, steel, and hushed multi-million-dollar conversations. From his corner office on the 42nd floor, Julian St. James looked down at the sprawling grid of Boston. The people below were nothing more than microscopic variables, moving through a system he understood perfectly. Money, leverage, and risk. Those were the only true laws of gravity. He turned away from the window as the heavy oak door clicked open. Nicole Davis, his senior executive assistant, stepped into the room. She was a master of discretion, a woman whose loyalty had been bought and paid for through years of brutal corporate acquisitions. She carried an iPad and a silver tray with his afternoon espresso. "The preliminary reports for the Tokyo merger are on your desk, Julian," Nicole said, setting the tray down with practiced silence. "And the legal team needs your signature on the restructuring draft by 5. "Hold the restructuring," Julian replied, his voice a low, even baritone. He walked over to his massive mahogany desk and sat down, steepling his fingers. "I have a different assignment for you, Nicole. One that requires absolute, unequivocal discretion. It does not touch the firm's servers. It does not go through standard compliance." Nicole paused, her stylus hovering over her screen. She had worked for Julian for 6 years. She knew the tone. It was the voice he used right before he dismantled a rival company. "Understood. What are we looking at?" "An individual, an architect named Dominic Beaumont," Julian said, saying the name with clinical detachment, as if diagnosing a tumor. "I want a complete financial autopsy. I don't care about his design awards or his portfolio. I want his debts. I want his outstanding lines of credit, his liquidity, his stalled projects, and any liens against his firm." Nicole's eyes flicked up for a fraction of a second, but her face remained perfectly neutral. "Deep dive. How far back?" 5 years, Julian instructed. "Find out who holds his paper. Find out where he bleeds." "I'll have a preliminary dossier by the end of the day," she said, turning on her heel and slipping out of the office, the door clicking softly shut behind her. Alone again, Julian reached for his espresso. His left hand rested on the dark wood of the desk. The platinum wedding band caught the cold, artificial light of the office. He stared at it. For 7 years, he had believed his marriage to Margot was an impenetrable fortress. They were 2 empires merged into one, functioning on mutual ambition and refined aesthetics. He had thought that was enough. He had thought passion was a volatile liability, better left to fools and artists. An artist like Dominic Beaumont. Julian closed his eyes, the image of Margot's dilated pupils and trembling smile flashing behind his eyelids. The betrayal stung, a sharp, twisting agony in his chest. But beneath the pain, a cold, predatory logic was taking shape. At 4:30 p.m., the secure line on his desk blinked. Julian picked it up. "I sent a heavily encrypted file to your personal tablet." Nicole's voice came through the speaker, crisp and entirely professional. "It's worse than we thought. Beaumont's firm, Architrave Designs, is a hollow shell." Julian tapped his screen, opening the file. Rows of red numbers and flagged banking alerts flooded the display. "Explain," Julian murmured, his eyes scanning the devastation. "He over-leveraged himself on 2 luxury residential developments in the Berkshires," Nicole explained. "The contractors walked out 3 months ago due to non-payment. He has 2 major balloon loans maturing in less than 60 days. If he doesn't secure a massive, immediate influx of liquid capital, he is facing total bankruptcy and potential fraud charges for misappropriating initial investor funds." Julian leaned back in his leather chair. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly shifted, locking together with a sickening, metallic click. Dominic wasn't just a romantic escape for a bored heiress. He was a drowning man. And Margot, with her vast, heavily restricted Sinclair trust funds, was a very beautiful, very naive life raft. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of the flesh. It was a heist. A dark, terrifying smile touched the corners of Julian's mouth. The ghost had found its leverage. The ivory tower penthouse was transformed into a theater of calculated elegance. Crystal flutes of Dom Perignon caught the soft, amber light of the massive chandeliers, and the low murmur of Boston's elite, hedge fund managers, gallery directors, and board members of Whitmore Capital, filled the sprawling living space. It was the annual pre-gala dinner, an event Margot usually executed with icy perfection. Tonight, however, her flawless facade was held together by sheer, terrified willpower. She stood near the grand piano wearing a backless black velvet gown that felt entirely like a straitjacket. On her left wrist, heavy and cold against her racing pulse, rested the vintage Cartier watch Julian had given her. Every tick of its diamond-encrusted face felt like a countdown to her own execution. Julian was holding court by the floor-to-ceiling windows, exuding the effortless charm of a man who owned the room and everyone breathing inside it. He caught her eye across the sea of bespoke suits and silk dresses. He raised his glass to her, a microscopic, chilling smile playing on his lips. Margot forced her mouth into a polite curve and quickly looked away, her stomach twisting into a painful knot. Then the brass doors of the private elevator chimed. The sound was ordinary, yet it sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight to Margot's heart. She turned toward the foyer, expecting the final guests, the mayor and his wife. Instead, Dominic Beaumont stepped onto the polished marble floor. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his rugged build, but his usual arrogant swagger was entirely absent. His dark eyes immediately darted through the crowd, a flash of genuine confusion crossing his features before landing on Margot. For a fraction of a second, the breath left her lungs. The room began to spin. What was he doing here? He wasn't on the guest list. He belonged in the shadows of their illicit afternoons, locked away in boutique hotel rooms, not bathed in the unforgiving, brilliant light of her marital home. Before Margot could move, before she could even draw a breath to speak, Julian materialized beside her. He placed a heavy, possessive hand on the bare skin of her lower back. She flinched, the contact burning like dry ice against her spine. "Ah, Mr. Beaumont," Julian's voice rang out, warm and impossibly smooth, cutting through the ambient chatter. "I'm so glad you could make it on such short notice." Julian guided a paralyzed Margot forward, closing the distance between husband, wife, and lover. Dominic stiffened, his jaw clenching as he looked from Margot's terrified, pleading eyes to Julian's serene face. "Julian," Dominic said, his voice tight, lacking its usual resonant confidence. "Thank you for the invitation. It was, unexpected." "Nonsense," Julian replied, casually signaling a waiter to bring Dominic a drink. "Margot has been speaking so highly of your structural concepts. When she mentioned she was considering you for the gallery expansion, I realized we simply had to invite you into our home. I always believe in understanding the men who want to work on my wife's foundations." The double entendre hung heavy in the air, entirely invisible to the surrounding guests but suffocating to the three of them. Dominic accepted a glass of champagne, his knuckles turning white around the fragile crystal stem. He looked at Margot, silently begging for a lifeline, for an explanation, but she was trapped, staring blankly at the silk lapel of Julian's jacket. Dominic opened his mouth, perhaps to salvage his pride, perhaps to offer a professional platitude, but Julian had already turned his attention away. "Darling," Julian said softly, leaning down so his lips brushed the delicate shell of Margot's ear. The sharp scent of his cologne was overpowering, erasing any trace of the air she needed to breathe. "Why don't you introduce our new architect to the Whitmore board? Let them see exactly what kind of man we are dealing with." Julian released her, stepping back to leave her suddenly cold and stranded in the crossfire of her own collapsing world. The ambient noise of the dinner party faded into a muted hum as Julian led Dominic down the long, dimly lit corridor toward the master study. Margot had spent the last hour introducing her lover to the city's most ruthless venture capitalists, her voice a fragile, brittle melody that Julian found immensely entertaining. Now it was time for the men to talk. Julian opened the heavy oak doors to his study. The room was a sanctuary of dark leather, first edition books, and a massive mahogany desk. It smelled of aged paper, expensive scotch, and ruthless ambition, a room designed entirely to intimidate. "Please come in," Julian offered, gesturing toward a deep wingback armchair. He walked over to the antique globe that served as a liquor cabinet. "Macallan, or do you prefer a drink with a bit more leverage?" Dominic stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the opulent space. The forced bravado he usually carried like a shield was cracking under the weight of Julian's unnerving hospitality. He adjusted his suit jacket, trying to reclaim some of his rugged charm. "Macallan is fine, thank you." Julian poured 2 glasses, the crystal clinking sharply in the quiet room. He handed one to Dominic, noting the microscopic tremor in the architect's fingers before leaning casually against the edge of his desk. Margot tells me your designs are quite revolutionary, Mr. Beaumont, Julian began, taking a slow sip. His dark eyes remained fixed on Dominic. She mentioned your focus on residential estates. The Berkshires, wasn't it? Dominic froze, the glass halfway to his lips. The mention of the Berkshires, the site of his collapsing, bankrupt development, was a targeted strike. He swallowed hard, lowering the glass. Yes, I have a few projects in development there. The topography presents a unique set of challenges. Challenges, Julian repeated, rolling the word around in his mouth as if tasting a bitter wine. I find that in both architecture and finance, challenges usually stem from a weak foundation. A man tries to build something magnificent, something he cannot afford, and he ends up over-leveraged. The contractors walk away. The structure sits empty, rotting from the inside out. The color drained completely from Dominic's face. He stared at Julian, the terrifying realization finally dawning on him that this conversation had absolutely nothing to do with architecture. I suppose that happens, Dominic managed to say, his voice tight, stripped of its usual resonance. But a good architect knows how to find alternative support. Julian smiled. It was a cold, predatory baring of teeth that did not reach his eyes. He set his glass down on the polished wood of the desk. Indeed, but a foolish architect tries to steal another man's foundation to prop up his own failing walls, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. He looks for a hidden asset, a wealthy backer, or perhaps a naive woman with a heavily restricted trust fund. The silence in the study became absolute, heavier than the oak doors, heavier than the suffocating tension that had gripped the penthouse all evening. Dominic stopped breathing. He looked up at Julian, seeing not just a wealthy husband, but an apex predator who had already dissected every inch of his miserable life. I don't know what you're talking about, Dominic lied, though the cold sweat gathering at his temples betrayed him entirely. Don't you? Julian stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a long, dark shadow over the armchair. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from Dominic's, his voice a dangerous, conspiratorial whisper. Let me give you a piece of professional advice, Dominic. Before you decide to trespass on someone else's property, you should always check who holds the deed. Because when the structure collapses, and it always collapses, I assure you, I am not the one who will be buried in the rubble. Julian straightened his tie, his expression instantly returning to a mask of serene, polite detachment. He picked up his glass and took a final sip. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe my wife is waiting for us. The last guest had departed, leaving the sprawling penthouse suffocating under the weight of an exhausted silence. Half-empty crystal champagne flutes littered the marble countertops, and the faint, lingering scent of expensive perfumes felt like the remnants of a ghost town. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, slowly loosening his silk tie as he looked out over the glittering, rain-slicked grid of Boston. Margot stood in the center of the living room. Her bare shoulders trembled beneath the straps of her velvet gown. The vintage Cartier watch on her wrist felt heavier than a steel shackle. She had spent the entire evening watching Julian weave Dominic through the crowd, introducing her lover to Whitmore board members and venture capitalists with a terrifying predatory grace. She could not endure another second of this psychological execution. Why did you do that? Her voice was a fragile, jagged whisper that cut through the quiet room. Julian did not turn around. He picked up his glass of mineral water, taking a slow, deliberate sip. Do what, Margot? Invite him here. She took a step forward, her composure finally fracturing. The icy, sophisticated heiress was entirely undone, replaced by a woman drowning in sheer panic. Why did you bring Dominic Beaumont into our home? What kind of sick, twisted game are you playing, Julian? He turned slowly. The ambient light from the city caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting a coldness that made Margot's blood run like ice. He set his glass down on the nearest table. The soft clink echoed like a judge's gavel. A game? Julian's voice was dangerously soft. He walked toward her, his footsteps deliberate, closing the distance until she had to tilt her head back to look at him. You think this is a game, Margot? You think I invited him here for my amusement? Then why? She choked out, tears of absolute terror welling in her eyes. Why are you torturing me? Julian stopped inches from her. The air between them grew so dense it was difficult to draw breath. I am not the one who invited a ghost into this marriage. I merely offered it a seat at the table. Margot opened her mouth to speak, to instinctively spin another desperate lie about architectural blueprints and gallery expansions, but the words died in her throat. Don't, Julian warned, reading her mind with terrifying accuracy. Do not insult my intelligence again. Do not mention blueprints or the Berkshires or the sudden, overwhelming need to redesign a gallery in Manhattan using an architect who is 3 weeks away from federal bankruptcy. Margot froze. Her breath hitched. The blood drained from her face so fast she swayed on her heels, the room spinning violently around her. Julian. Tuesday night, Harborview Restaurant, the VIP section. Julian delivered the words with the clinical precision of a surgeon operating without anesthesia. I went for a drink after a brutal board meeting, and instead of a quiet scotch, I found my wife, wearing the emerald dress I bought her for our anniversary, letting another man caress her hands over candlelight. A sharp sob tore from Margot's throat. She covered her mouth with her trembling fingers, stepping back as if he had physically struck her. I saw you, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper. I stood 10 feet away, and I watched you look at him with a hunger you haven't shown me in years. You were so entirely captivated by his tragic, starving artist routine that you didn't even notice the executioner walking up to your table. I'm sorry, she gasped, the tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, ruining her perfect makeup. Julian, please, it was a mistake. It meant nothing. Do not lie to me. Julian's voice cracked like a whip, the first and only display of raw, unrestrained fury. The sound reverberated off the glass walls, shattering the carefully constructed quiet of the penthouse. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his dark eyes burning with a cold, consuming fire. It wasn't a mistake, Margot. It was a choice. A choice you made every time you lied about your trips to New York. And starting tomorrow, you are going to understand exactly what that choice is going to cost you. The mahogany-paneled office of Brian Cooper, a senior partner at Bennett & Hayes, smelled of old money, lemon polish, and leather bindings. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Boston Harbor churned under a slate-gray sky, mirroring the cold, violent undercurrents of the meeting taking place within. Julian sat in a high-backed leather chair, his posture perfectly rigid. Spread across the expansive glass desk between him and Brian were dozens of financial statements, bank transfers, and shell company filings. They were not love letters. They were not motel receipts. They were something far more damning. Brian, a man whose tailored suits hit a mind like a steel trap, adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and tapped a manicured finger against a highlighted column of numbers. Your assistant, Nicole, is exceptionally thorough, Julian, Brian said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that belonged in smoke-filled back rooms. I had my forensic accountants verify the data she pulled. The trail is heavily obfuscated through 3 different LLCs registered in Delaware, but the origin point is undeniable. Julian stared at the documents, his jaw tightening into a sharp, unforgiving line. Walk me through it. Margot hasn't just been sleeping with Dominic Beaumont, Brian stated flatly, stripping away any lingering illusions of a tragic, sweeping romance. She has been financing his survival. Over the past 4 months, there have been systematic recurring transfers from her secondary Sinclair Trust Fund, the one strictly allocated for charitable endowments and gallery acquisitions. Julian felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over him. The sharp, agonizing sting of physical betrayal he had felt at the restaurant was rapidly being replaced by the icy, familiar territory of corporate warfare. How much? Julian asked, his voice dead of all emotion. A little over $2.4 million, Brian replied, sliding a final sheet of paper across the desk. Liquidated and funneled directly into Architrave Designs to keep Beaumont's creditors at bay. It was a bridge loan, off the books, entirely illegal under the terms of your marital estate. Julian picked up the paper. The black ink looked like poison seeping into the crisp white page. He had spent the last 3 days torturing Margot psychologically, assuming she was just a bored, wealthy housewife seduced by the rugged charm of a starving artist. He had underestimated her. She wasn't just a cheating wife. She was an embezzler. She had weaponized their marriage to keep her lover afloat. She thought she was clever, Julian murmured, dropping the paper back onto the desk, using the gallery expansion as a cover for the capital outflow. It was sloppy, Brian corrected. He leaned back, lacing his fingers together. And it is the exact leverage we need. Julian, we drafted your prenuptial agreement to be an impenetrable fortress. Section 4, paragraph B, the financial fidelity clause. Any unauthorized diversion of marital or heavily restricted trust assets constitutes a fundamental breach of the contract, Julian recited from memory, the legal jargon tasting like ash in his mouth. Exactly, Brian said, a shark-like smile touching the corners of his mouth. Infidelity is messy. It's he said, she said. It's emotional. But this is a paper trail. By moving that money, Margot didn't just break her vows. She triggered a default in the prenup. If you file for divorce based on financial fraud, the Sinclair family cannot contest your standing at Whitmore Capital without exposing their golden daughter to federal tax evasion charges. Julian turned his gaze toward the stormy harbor. The rain was beginning to fall again, streaking the glass. He finally had his weapon. The gun was loaded, the safety was off, and the target was painted squarely on the woman sleeping in his guest room. "Draft the papers," Julian commanded, his voice as cold as the glass against the storm. "I want the initial filing ready by tomorrow morning, but do not submit them yet." Brian raised an eyebrow. "Why wait? You have her by the throat." "Because," Julian said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket with slow, deliberate precision, "I am not going to just take her money, Brian. I am going to make her choose what she wants to lose." The heavy overcast sky of Boston mirrored the suffocating atmosphere inside the Ivory Tower penthouse. It was Friday morning, the day of the hospital charity gala. Margot sat at the edge of the sprawling velvet sofa, wrapped in a cashmere shawl that offered no warmth. She was a ghost haunting her own life, a prisoner waiting for the executioner's axe to fall after the devastating confrontation 3 nights ago. The private elevator chimed. Julian stepped out, his posture impeccably straight, his expression an unreadable mask of corporate detachment. In his right hand, he carried a thick, unmarked manila folder. He did not greet her. He walked directly to the glass coffee table, dropping the folder with a heavy, definitive thwack that made Margot flinch. "Open it," Julian commanded, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. Margot stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. With trembling fingers, she reached out and flipped the cover back. She expected to see photographs from a private investigator, grainy, humiliating images of her and Dominic walking into a boutique hotel in Cambridge. She expected motel receipts. She expected undeniable proof of her broken vows. Instead, she saw spreadsheets, highlighted bank transfers, the incorporation documents of 3 distinct Delaware LLCs. The blood rushed from her head so fast she felt entirely weightless. The air vanished from her lungs. $2.4 million, Margot, Julian stated, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. Funneled from the Sinclair Charitable Trust, routed through shell companies, and deposited directly into the failing, hollowed-out accounts of Architrave Designs. You didn't just give Dominic Beaumont your body. You gave him your family's legacy to pay off his balloon loans. Julian, She choked on the words, the sheer terror paralyzing her vocal cords. The romantic, desperate illusion of her affair, the idea that it was a passionate rebellion against a loveless marriage, evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, brutal reality of federal wire fraud. It was a bridge loan, Julian continued, weaponizing the exact legal terminology his lawyers had prepared. An illegal diversion of heavily restricted marital assets, a direct, unequivocal violation of Section 4, paragraph B of our prenuptial agreement. He leaned over the table, placing his knuckles on the glass, forcing her to look up into his dark, merciless eyes. "I could file these papers today," he whispered, the quietness of his voice infinitely more terrifying than a scream. "I could walk into a courtroom and strip you of everything. The Whitmore board would absorb your shares. The Sinclair family would disown you to avoid the scandal of their golden heiress embezzling funds for a bankrupt lover. And Dominic? The SEC would crucify him for misappropriating investor capital. You would both be left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your backs." A single hot tear escaped Margot's eye, tracking through the pale makeup she had meticulously applied. She was trapped. There was no escape, no romantic cinematic exit where she and Dominic ran away together into the sunset. They wouldn't just be poor, they would be disgraced, hunted, and ruined. Or, Julian said, straightening up, buttoning his suit jacket with an agonizingly slow precision. There is an alternative. Margot looked up, a pathetic, desperate shred of hope flickering in her chest. What do you want? I want you to attend the gala tonight, Julian replied, his tone chillingly conversational. You will smile. You will be the perfect, devoted wife. And then you are going to sever every tie you have with Mr. Beaumont. No phone calls, no secret meetings, and absolutely no more Sinclair money. You will sit here, in this penthouse, and you will watch his firm collapse into bankruptcy. You will let him drown. Margot gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. Julian, please, you can't ask me to do that. He'll be destroyed. I am not asking, Margot, Julian said softly, turning his back on her and walking toward the elevator. I am telling you the price of your survival. You have until 8 o'clock tonight to make your choice. Make sure you wear the Cartier watch. The heavy steel doors slid shut, leaving Margot alone with the financial autopsy of her own heart. The heavy rain had returned, battering the reinforced glass of the ivory tower penthouse like desperate fists. It was 7:30 on Friday evening. Margot stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite, staring at a stranger. She wore a midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown, her hair swept up into a flawless, icy chignon. Around her left wrist, the vintage Cartier watch ticked with a heavy, mechanical heartbeat, a diamond-encrusted shackle binding her to the St. James Empire. She was ready for the hospital gala. She was ready to step back into her gilded cage. The muted chime of the private elevator echoed through the foyer. Margot froze. Julian was already in the penthouse, finishing a call in his study. The security downstairs was supposed to be impenetrable, but the sudden, heavy thud of footsteps rapidly approaching the living room told her the perimeter had been breached. Margot stepped out of the suite, her heels sinking into the plush Persian runner. Dominic stood in the center of the living room. He looked nothing like the arrogant, rugged architect who had confidently occupied her bed 3 days ago. His charcoal suit was soaked from the rain, his tie was loose, and his eyes were wild with a frantic, cornered energy. He had clearly bribed or forced his way past the concierge. Margot, he gasped, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He reached out, his wet hands gripping her bare shoulders. I've been calling you all day. Why haven't you answered? The bank is calling in the balloon loans tomorrow. Did you authorize the transfer from the Sinclair Trust? I need that bridge capital tonight, or they are locking the doors to my firm. The raw, ugly truth of his panic struck Margot like a physical blow. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't ask if Julian knew. He asked about the money. The sweeping, cinematic romance they had built in shadowed hotel rooms instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a transaction. Before Margot could find the breath to speak, a slow, hollow clapping resonated from the hallway. Julian emerged from the shadows of his study, impeccably dressed in a tailored black tuxedo. He walked toward them with the terrifying, unhurried grace of a predator who had already cornered his prey. Bravo, Mr. Beaumont, Julian murmured, his voice cutting through the ambient sound of the storm. A truly impassioned plea, but I am afraid you are knocking on a vault that has already been sealed. Dominic spun around, stepping instinctively in front of Margot, though his bravado was clearly crumbling. Julian, this doesn't concern you. It concerns me entirely, considering it is my marital estate you are attempting to bleed dry, Julian replied, stopping a few feet away. He slipped his hands smoothly into his trouser pockets, projecting an aura of absolute, immovable power. The Sinclair Trust transfers have been permanently flagged and frozen by my forensic accountants. There will be no bridge capital. There will be no rescue. Your firm is dead, Dominic. The color drained from Dominic's face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. He turned back to Margot, his eyes wide with desperate disbelief. Margot, tell him. Tell him we're leaving. Tell him you're taking your shares, and we are walking out of here right now. Margot looked at the man she had risked everything for. She saw the sweat on his brow, the trembling in his hands, the sheer, pathetic panic of a man drowning in his own hubris. Then she looked past him to Julian. Her husband stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to deliver the execution. The silence in the penthouse stretched, taut and agonizing, broken only by the ticking of the Cartier watch against her pulse. "I can't," Margot whispered, her voice fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces. "What?" Dominic breathed, stepping toward her. "Margot, we love each other. We built a plan." "There is no plan, Dominic," Margot cried out, the tears finally spilling over, ruining her flawless facade. She took a step back, wrapping her arms around her own waist to keep from falling apart completely. "If I leave with you, he will expose the transfers. He will file federal fraud charges. I will lose my family, my shares, my entire life, and you will go to prison." Dominic stared at her, the reality of his total defeat finally crushing the air from his lungs. He was bankrupt, he was ruined, and the wealthy heiress who was supposed to be his salvation had just severed the rope. "You should leave, Mr. Beaumont," Julian stated, his tone as cold and final as a closing coffin. "Security is already on their way up. I strongly suggest you spend the weekend packing up your office." The heavy brass doors of the private elevator closed, severing Dominic Beaumont from the ivory tower penthouse and from Margot's life forever. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, ringing in Margot's ears like the deafening aftermath of a bomb blast. She stood frozen on the Persian rug, staring at the polished metal of the doors, while the phantom heat of her lover's panicked grip slowly faded from her bare shoulders. Julian did not gloat. He did not offer a comforting touch or a cruel reprimand. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo, checking the time on his own platinum watch before walking toward the foyer. "The car is waiting, Margot," he said, his voice a smooth, flat expanse of ice. "We have a hospital wing to endow." 2 hours later, they descended the sweeping grand staircase of the Boston Symphony Hall. The charity gala was a suffocating sea of flashbulbs, diamond necklaces, and predatory smiles. As they reached the bottom step, stepping onto the red carpet, Julian placed his hand on the small of Margot's back. The gesture was flawlessly executed for the society photographers, a portrait of an untouchable, devoted billionaire guiding his beautiful, elegant wife. But to Margot, the weight of his hand felt like the cold iron bars of a prison cell snapping permanently shut. She leaned into him, a microscopic, performative tilt of her head, and smiled for the cameras. It was a terrifyingly perfect smile, entirely devoid of light. "Julian, Margot, you both look absolutely stunning," the mayor's wife gushed, materializing through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes. "We were just discussing Whitmore Capital's latest quarter. You two are simply an unstoppable force." "Thank you, Eleanor," Julian replied, his effortless charm radiating like a well-rehearsed symphony. He took a flute of Dom Perignon and handed it to his wife, his fingers briefly brushing hers. "Margot is the true visionary of the family. I simply build the structures to house her brilliance." Margot took a sip of the champagne. It tasted like ash and battery acid. She looked up at her husband, staring at the handsome, aristocratic lines of his profile as he conversed with a state senator. He had won. Julian had outmaneuvered her, crushed her lover into financial dust, and secured his corporate empire without a single drop of his own blood hitting the floor. He had successfully protected the Sinclair-St. James alliance. The board at Whitmore Capital would never know how close the firm had come to a catastrophic public scandal. The heavily restricted trusts remained entirely untouched. Their vast wealth was secure. But as Julian briefly turned his head to meet her gaze, the victory soured completely in his mouth. The woman looking back at him was no longer the icy, sophisticated heiress he had married, nor was she the desperate, trembling wife he had caught in the restaurant. She was entirely hollowed out. Her eyes, once swimming with secrets and terrified hunger, were now completely dead, filled with a pure, distilled, silent venom that he knew would never fade. As they moved through the glittering ballroom, greeting CEOs and venture capitalists, Julian felt the suffocating weight of the empire he had saved. He had forced her to stay, effectively chaining her to his side to protect his assets. But in doing so, he had murdered the last fragile ghost of their humanity. They were no longer husband and wife. They were two corporate entities bound by a ruthless prenuptial agreement, occupying the exact same gilded cage, waiting for the oxygen to finally run out. The vintage Cartier watch on Margot's wrist ticked loudly against her pulse, a heavy, diamond-encrusted shackle counting down the hours, the days, and the decades of the life sentence she had just accepted. 6 months had passed since the night of the hospital gala, yet the ivory tower penthouse felt as though it were still frozen in that singular, icy moment of betrayal. The seasons had changed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the vibrant autumn leaves of the Boston Public Garden giving way to the skeletal, gray branches of a harsh New England winter. Inside, the temperature never seemed to rise above freezing. Julian stood in the center of the master study, the room where he had once dismantled Dominic Beaumont's soul with a few sentences about foundations and leverage. On the massive mahogany desk sat a single elegant fountain pen and 2 sets of documents, bound in heavy blue cardstock. The silence was broken by the soft chime of the elevator. Margot stepped out. She was dressed in a simple, charcoal gray wool suit. Her face was thin, her cheekbones sharper than they had been in the spring. She had honored her side of the ultimatum with a terrifying, clinical precision. She had watched from the sidelines as Architrave Designs filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. She had remained silent as the gossip columns whispered about Dominic Beaumont's sudden disappearance from the Boston social scene. She had played the part of the devoted St. James wife at every board dinner, every charity auction, and every Hollow family brunch. But the price of her silence had been her spirit. She moved through the penthouse like a ghost, haunting the site of its own murder. "The lawyers have reviewed everything," Julian said, his voice flat and weary. There was no triumph left in his tone, no predatory edge. Even his tailored suit seemed to hang slightly heavy on his frame. "The assets have been liquidated and partitioned as per the final amendment. The Sinclair Trust remains intact. My standing at Whitmore Capital is secure. There will be no public scandal, only a quiet statement about irreconcilable differences." Margot walked toward the desk. She didn't look at him. She looked at the documents. The divorce papers were the final structural drawings of their life together, a map of how to tear down an empire without making a sound. "You got what you wanted, Julian," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You protected the firm. You protected the name. You won." Julian looked at her, and for the first time in years, the mask of the ruthless executive slipped. He saw the woman he had once loved, or at least the woman he had believed he could build a life with. He realized now that his victory was the most expensive failure of his career. He had secured the walls, but he had let the house burn down from the inside. "I didn't win, Margot," he said, his voice cracking with a sudden, rare vulnerability. "I just didn't lose as much as you did." Margot picked up the fountain pen. It felt heavy, like a weapon. She turned to the final page where her name was printed in cold, block letters. As she leaned down to sign, a single hot tear escaped her eye. It fell onto the crisp white paper, a small dark blossom of salt and ink that blurred the legal jargon. She signed her name. The scratching of the nib against the paper was the only sound in the room. She set the pen down and slowly unbuckled the vintage Cartier watch from her wrist. The diamonds caught the gray, winter light one last time before she placed it gently on top of the signed documents. "Time is up, Julian," she said softly. Julian watched her as she turned and walked toward the foyer. She didn't take any luggage. She didn't take the emerald dress or the velvet gowns. She took nothing but the heavy, invisible burden of her choices. He sat down in his leather chair, the same chair where he had once plotted his revenge. He looked at the watch, its mechanical heart still ticking away, indifferent to the wreckage of the humans who had worn it. He looked at the blurred ink on the divorce papers where her tear had landed. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of the mahogany desk, the foundation of his empire. "We built an empire, Margot," Julian whispered into the empty, echoing room. "It's a shame we forgot to build a home." He closed his eyes as the sound of the private elevator echoed one last time, leaving him alone in the ivory tower, surrounded by everything he owned and nothing he loved.